Okay, it is 8 o'clock on the dot. Welcome to those who are joining us on the live stream on Facebook, as well as those who are joining in on the Zoom platform and on the Eventbrite platform. This is amongst our first attempts at live streaming webinars, so I hope that everything goes smoothly. If not, we are recording the session, so we will edit together it nicely and then share it on Facebook and various other places afterwards. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on Muslim and Indigenous sacred spaces. My name is Ustam Bulbudia. I work at the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies doing community engagement work. Before we begin with tonight's event, I wanted to acknowledge the land that I'm on. I am on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh land. And as I recognize the land, I think about the generations that have stewarded this land for thousands and thousands of years. I think about the way that, as Jabala was talking about just now, the salmon of this land were protected, the cedar trees, the various other forests and plants and species were looked after to ensure that we can still live on this land sustainably, that we take advantage of our ability to drink clean water and eat good food grown on this land as well. We also recognize that it is unceded land. There was never a treaty signed. There was never a war that was waged. There was nothing that actually handed this land over from Indigenous people to settlers. Over time, the land was encroached and encroached and encroached upon. And as a Muslim on this land, I think about what my spiritual obligation is to this land and what I will say to my Creator when I meet Him, knowing that I lived on land that was not rightful for me to be on. As you hear this land acknowledgement, will also invite you to think about the land that you are on. If you'd like to post that as a comment, if you'd like to share that on the Facebook stream, feel free to do so. Just to think about the people who looked after this land and all that it provides. And if you think about the Creator who provided this land, think about obligations to justice that we take along with our chosen path. It's my pleasure to welcome our two speakers who are joining us this evening. Jabala August-Sjodin is the hereditary princess and chief of the Secwepemc, or is it Shuswap? I've been trying to look it up, tribal nation. How do we pronounce that?
In Secwepemc, it's Secwepemc. But yes, it's been by the settlers switched over to sound more like Shuswap somehow.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I've heard both, and thank you for clarifying Secwepemc, tribal nation. Jabala is also a new revert to Islam. Jabala was astounded to discover the commonalities between Islam and the ancient spiritual teachings of her ancestors. She is now the first indigenous Muslimah of her tribe. Among her indigenous community, Jabala is the matriarch of the Secwepemc Women's Sacred Fire Council, alongside 3 other tribal sisters of hereditary lineage. This council oversees many grassroots movements, namely they are the female stewards of the earth, land and water protectors. In 2011, Jabala founded Peacekeeper Mediation and Restorative Justice, where she offers a sacred space for managing complex issues. In this space, healing and support is delivered through facilitation and peacemaking circles, a traditional form of tribal conflict resolution with peace as its central principle. Thank you for joining us this evening, Jabala. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'd also like to welcome Rizwan. Rizwan Mawani was previously research coordinator and lead researcher at the London-based Institute of Ismaili Studies, Department of Community Relations, where he conducted field research on Muslim practices amongst 50 communities in 17 countries, from Senegal and Iran to Saudi Arabia and Indonesia. His book, Beyond the Mosque, Diverse Spaces of Muslim Worship, published in 2019, is the first book of its kind exploring the diversity of ritual, piety, and religious space amongst contemporary Muslims. If you can get your hand on a copy of that book, I highly, highly recommend it. It's how I came to know Rizwan, and I was really delighted to hear that he's based in Vancouver and that we were able to connect on this project. Rizwan has also been published in the Wall Street Journal and Huffington Post, helping to make the complexity and diversity of the Muslim world more intelligible to broader audiences, along with encyclopedias, academic and community journals. He has a background in anthropology and religious studies with degrees from Canada and the US, and regularly speaks to international audiences ranging from students to policymakers. Most recently, he has been working with global Muslim youth from over 20 countries, developing curriculum to help them better develop skills of resilience and service to better equip them for our changing world. And finally, I'd like to welcome all of our attendees this evening. Thank you for joining us from wherever you're joining us from. And if you're watching a recording of this, welcome to this as well. I'd like to begin just by framing this conversation. Luckily, Rizwan, Jabala, and I have had a few opportunities to connect over the phone in the lead up to this. And every time we connect, we just go on and on and on, and the conversation never seems to end and just gets more and more expansive and harder to narrow down into a focus for this. So there's a few things that I wanted to say just at the outset. So the first is around the diversity of both Muslim and Indigenous communities. So when we're trying to speak about sacred space from our perspectives, it's so close to impossible to do this and give justice to every single community that we may or may not be talking about. And there is also a risk sometimes when we speak about the Muslim or the Indigenous person as if it's a homogenous group or homogenous community. We run the risk of erasing stories, of erasing complexities, of erasing contradictions that are really important when we get down to things. So we're trying to do justice to the diversity of the conversation, but at the same time, we know how difficult that is. So we will be speaking in broad terms, and we'll do our best to address the diversity. But we also know that this is a conversation where we won't be able to cover everything. And hopefully it will be the seeds to spark many, many, many further conversations down the line. So how are we going to try and frame this conversation? We decided on trying to use time, so kind of like a past, present, future framework that we can use just to guide the conversation a little bit, although it will most likely just be a free-flowing dialogue that we get to enjoy this evening. We also recognize that time takes on a very different dimension when we're talking about the sacred. And things like indigeneity, Islam, time, space, sacred, all of the key words that we might use for this evening's conversation, all of them avoid neat boxes and neat definitions. We also invite questions that anybody has throughout this evening. So you can use the Q&A box on Zoom, or you can leave questions on the Facebook page. And thank you to Yara, one of the research assistants at the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, who will be looking at those questions and making sure that we see them over here as well. We'll also make some time for addressing questions at the end if they don't come through the dialogue itself. I'll now ask Jabala and Rizwan to introduce themselves further, welcoming them into the conversation and asking them in particular what lenses they bring into this conversation based on who they are and the lives that they live. Jabala, can we start with you?
Hi, it's so great to be here, and thank you, Aslam, for such a beautiful introduction. And it's fabulous to sit with you as well, Rizwan. And I've peered into your book. Everybody should read that book. It's amazing. It gave me a new light on this topic for sure. I am from the Secwepemc Nation. I am a hereditary princess, and my background is from both. I have a Swedish father and a native mother of Secwepemc ancestry. And the way that I come into this conversation in particular is that I've had the lens of both the Indigenous side as well as the Muslim side of the concept of sacred spaces, and the exposure I've had has been sort of middle road, as you would say, being able to sit on a fence and look at both sides of the story and interpret from my perspective the way I was raised and compare it to this new life that I've adopted. And I did recently revert, and it's been quite a journey as a First Nations woman in Canada to do this this amazing thing. It's been life-changing. I bring this knowledge back to my tribe now, and I can say that it has been one of the most beautiful beautiful gifts that I feel I'm bringing back to the tribe. And it's been my focus. I do have the hope to unite as many humans as possible, but specifically, I'd love to see more Muslims and Indigenous come together in solidarity. Thank you.
Again, Aslam and Yara and others from SFU's Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, thank you again for inviting me to the conversation. Jabala, it's been fantastic to interact with you so far and to learn a lot more about your story and your traditions. And I imagine this conversation will be just as rich as the previous ones we've had. In terms of the lens that I bring, in 2000, well, many years before that, I actually began to study Islam academically. I began with studying Islam from a religious studies perspective and an anthropology perspective. And I realized very early on that religious studies and anthropology looked at religion in very, very different ways. One used the lens of scripture to look at what Muslims believe, and one looked at the lens of what people do and practice on the ground. And as we know, those conversations are always unfolding. The role of culture, the role of geography, the role of time, of course, plays a significant place in how we understand what it means to be Muslim from those two lenses. And in 2005, after my graduate work, I was enlisted to be involved in a project to try and document the practices and spaces of Muslim communities around the world. And what began as a modest 4-country project unfolded into a very large 17-country project that took me around the world, from Muslim majority countries like Iran and Senegal to Muslim minority countries such as India and China and everywhere in between. And I quickly began to realize that what I thought I had learned about Islam from the classroom was very, very different from what I was seeing in practice. Every country I went to enlightened me about what it meant to be Muslim in novel ways. And I was fascinated by what I was learning from Muslims on the ground, how traditional knowledge bore on what it meant to be Muslim, how the cultures that preceded Islam in those regions also found their way to peek through into the practice of Islam in fascinating ways. I did my best to try and encapsulate some of that in the recent book that I wrote. But I realized as I was writing the book that I couldn't write a single sentence because every sentence had about 100 exceptions to the rule. And it became, a very challenging task by which to do it. And so what I hope to bring to the conversation today is that lens of diversity by which we can maybe understand Islam, its spaces, its practices, its rights, and trying to better make sense of what it actually means to be Muslim, outside of that singular narrative that we tend to see in textbooks or we learn in the classroom, but to try and capture the voices of as many Muslims as possible in talking about what it means to be Muslim and through the lenses particularly of space and practice.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think both of those lenses are quite unique. I think when we often hear about Islam, we tend to hear it from like a single perspective. And I think in the academic study of Islam, we sometimes hear more diversity. We hear about the exceptions, as well as to have someone who has insight in both Muslim and Indigenous ways of being and knowing and what the sacred looks like and shows up, and to kind of highlight some of those similarities that many of us are completely unaware of. I think are going to be really interesting to dig a bit deeper into. So let's start right at the beginning of time, at the beginning of space. What are the different traditions telling us about what sacred space means in the mythic time or in the mythic past? Rizwan, you brought this up. Do you want to start with that? And I've got some photos that I can share if you'd like me to cue me on any of those as well.
I think if when we begin in mythic time, we begin, obviously the time, before we have an earthly time. And we see this, right through the Quran, even with the stories of the earliest prophets. We see this in the Bible and in other monotheistic traditions as well, that when we're talking about time, prophetic time, prophets live for hundreds of years. They precede and supersede whatever we understand as human time to be. And so it's one of the ways to read this is this idea of a sense of knowledge that supersedes any sense of time and knowledge that a human lifetime can provide. And of course, the first human beings we're introduced to in the monotheistic story are the individuals of Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve don't seem to live in a place that has many structures, but actually live in a garden alongside nature. And so this idea of the garden, which is often equated with paradise in translations of this sort of earliest time, talk about living alongside nature, living, of course, with each other, living in a world where the natural world means, in some ways, being alongside the divine. There really isn't a separation between the divine as a voice and the natural world in which the garden is situated. And so very, very early on, we see that. And even before that, before Adam and Eve, as the tradition narrates to us, are created, there is this sense that God creates the world in the Muslim tradition, so he can be known. And in certain mystical traditions, there is this larger sense that God creates the world so he can be loved. And so at the root of all of these things are knowledge and love. And it's from knowledge and love that the world precipitates. And one of the first things that God creates, even before humanity is created, is this, God sits on a throne. And one of the things that we see in the world that we live in the earthly world, that we associate with Islam, is the pilgrimage to Mecca, to the Kaaba. The Kaaba for Muslims is very sacred for many Muslims because it is the focal point by which prayer takes place. When men and women gather at the Hajj or the Umrah pilgrimage over the course of the year, we see, interestingly, men and women, first of all, coming together in unison. This is one thing that's very unique about this particular space in the Muslim world, because today, when we think about Muslim space, we think about segregation between men and women in many of the places that we think about. But at least until now, although I know the Saudi government has made a number of attempts to try and change these customs and rules, that men and women come together. And we see this at the most, in many of the most heightened rituals amongst religious traditions, that this idea of gender is ultimately dissolved. And so while we talk about the first man and the first woman, it's also important for us to recognize that gender in some ways is dissolved in this annual pilgrimage that takes place to the Hajj every year. And this notion of circumambulating or moving around the Kaaba in obeisance to the divine, in honoring the divine and returning to that divine origin in some ways, is also related to the garden. Because it's here that people are reminded of their proximity to the divine. They're reminded this idea of the human body and gender is somewhat dissolved. And the traditions state that this idea of the Kaaba being created is really an earthly echo or an earthly mirror of the kind of throne that God himself sat on at the beginning of the world, and the angels circumambulated around. And so in some ways you have this kind of axis that relates the earthly domain to the heavenly domain. And so we see some very interesting echoes in the sense of at least mythic time, and mythic time translated into earthly time, of number one, the Kaaba, and then number two, this idea of nature. And there is a verse of the Quran that talks about everywhere you turn is the face of God. There's this idea, and when I think of that, it's very clear to me that what may have been intended, or at least one way to interpret that verse, is this idea of nature all around us. It's through the echoes of nature that we become aware of God, of the echoes and the mirrors in which he presents himself, and she presents himself to us. And I think it's very, very important that that verse is there, because it's the one place in which I think we are brought very clearly into conversation with the divine. And of course, we can think of our own moment, whether it's at the time of sunset, or after a rainbow, after a beautiful storm, or in the dead silence of the desert, where we're reminded of the infiniteness and the beauty of God's and the divine's creation to us. But it's really the notion of space in its earliest forms is really a window into thinking about both, I think, nature and the divine in interesting ways. And so we see these things translating, of course, into the earthly realm, and then cascading through politics and other sorts of things over time. But I think in the purest forms, we see these echoes of the divine command and the divine order present themselves in some beautiful ways.
Yeah, yeah. So we start with like the stories of the gardens, and we start with kind of the different dimensions of space, right? So like the earthly realm and the heavenly realm. Jabala, what's coming up for you? Are those similar concepts, things that you've been familiar with, that you've heard through different traditions as well?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to touch on the time and space, since we're here talking about sacred spaces, and we've sort of went with a theme of past, present, future, just this timeline. It's the same like within Indigenous culture, that when you think about where we originate, you know, this is something everybody who's researched or looked into Indigenous people, they're always trying to find out, when did they arrive to the North America, to Turtle Island, and they're trying to timestamp us. But it's the tribal belief, you'll hear this across the diverse tribes, that there is no such thing as when we arrived. We'll say that we've been here since time immemorial. And I would say within our culture, we do lose the whole mapping of time, in the sense that when we seek to connect or reconnect to God, or Great Spirit as we call them, we find that time stands still. We become very present, we're in the moment. And so that's a really important piece, because as we start moving into our humanistic lower self-understanding of this, we can become a little bit befuddled and forget our purpose, right? So whenever I think of divine or sacred spaces, I really think of it as a way to manifest divine power. So we visit these sacred spaces as a way to find and reconnect to God. So looking back before colonialization, I would say that as Native people, we also had this concept of everywhere you turn is the face of God. And we see this in the way that the Indigenous will pray towards the north, the east, the south, and the west. They'll honor the four directions. That's a form of acknowledging that Great Spirit is using his dynamic energy in those areas to control, whether it's the winds of the north or the elemental forces, right? So that's definitely a deep acknowledgement of that. And when we talk about, like you mentioned, the Kaaba, we also have a similar thing where we will go in and create a specific monument, as if you would say. Our people were quite nomadic. We traveled about. So some of our items we would bring with us. And what I'm talking about specifically is the sweat lodge, for example. Like we have the Kaaba in Islam, but in Indigenous ways, we have a lodge, a sweat lodge house, that can be set up or taken down. It would be similar to a mosque, I guess you could say, where you can set it up and have a temporary mosque where you can go in and pray. And with that structure comes certain items and certain understandings, and the teachings behind the sweat lodge always bring you back into connection with Great Spirit. And particularly with Mother Earth, because when you're inside the sweat lodge, they say that it's like you're back in the womb of your mother. And I'm sure you've heard the term Mother Earth, because it's become quite popular these days. Everybody sort of adopted that, the Mother Earth that we live on. And so that's yeah, I think that's a commonality that I find between the Kaaba and some of our spaces. There seems to be influence around us that we are almost inborn with wanting to seek some place or something that brings us back to God. And we definitely see that among the tribal people, as well as that we believe we're born of God, in a sense that we're born closer to Great Spirit, and in this existence where as we get exposed to the world and things around us, we might move further away from Great Spirit. And so the goal in the life of a native is always to reconnect and constantly find ways to stay in prayer and stay connected to Great Spirit. And we do this, the same, like what Rizwan was mentioning, that there's echoes of paradise in nature. This is the epitome of Indigenous culture. And I use the word culture, but I know Native viewers will know what I'm talking about here. But when I think of culture in Native life, there's no separation between religion and culture. Our whole lifestyle is based around prayer and based around constantly reconnecting. And the way that we do this is by being in nature, because everything that was created has that dynamic creative energy. And there's stories among our people that say that we were born into this earth to learn. And the lessons, where do we find those lessons? Well, it's become very natural to seek lessons in everything that we see. For example, the birds. We can learn lessons from the birds, as we know that they've designed aircrafts after the birds. There's plants that have certain energies. And one of the things that I've studied myself as a young person growing in a medicine lineage is that everything has a vibration. Everything has a certain energy. This is what we believe is a stamp of Great Spirits that he's put on everything. So when I was created, I have a certain energy that comes with me. When a plant was created, it has a certain energy. And the most beautiful thing that I've seen in metaphysics is now proving this, is that we are in harmony with our surroundings. So when we look at a plant, and I'll give you an example, like the hawthorn bush, or I guess you could call it a shrub, but anyways, the hawthorn bush, it has a certain vibration. And they found that, like, we've used this medicine for a long time. Hawthorn berries are known in our culture to help cure heart diseases, sicknesses, ailments, grieving, anything that's heart-centered. And we feel we got this information directly from Great Spirit way back, maybe when Adam and Eve were first here. Since time immemorial, we have always had this knowledge. So we take the hawthorn bush, and we realize now that the vibration of the hawthorn entrains or works with the vibration of our heart to bring a healing or a cure. And so we're finding this more and more, that our surroundings are directly influencing our existence, and our existence is directly influencing our surroundings. So yeah, those are the key points that popped out for me as I listened to Rizwan.
Yeah, I think there's this interesting notion of, like, you know, God is everywhere, or that like the whole world is a place of prayer. And yet at the same time, there's specific sites, right? There's the Kaaba, there's the Dome of the Rock, there's, and even, you know, within Indigenous people, there's certain spaces that have more religious significance or spiritual significance. So there's that element that's intention around, like, everywhere, but then specific spaces. But then in conversation, we've also talked about, like, the creation of the mosque or the church or the temple. There's something around the specifying of a certain space as sacred. And also what that does psychologically is, like, allow what is outside of that space to be less than or less sacred, and allows for some sort of extractive processes to take place. So this is like part of the colonial journey, is like, okay, well, if we have this as a sacred space, then everything else is not. And then we can take advantage and extract and exploit. Yeah, Rizwan, you mentioned some of this, the moment of the creation of the mosque, or whatever it is, and like how power intersects with the sacredness of space.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things we can, Jabala lit up 18 lights in my head, and there's lots of different ways that we can go. I think there's really interesting things. So when we, obviously, to your point, Aslam, and to Joel's point about the creation of space, oftentimes we see this, especially with the beginning of religious tradition, that first space has a very sacred character to it. We see this with migrant communities. The first time a sacred space is built in a new environment, in a new country, this oftentimes marks it's the hallmark date by when a community is established. And so space becomes a marker of time, a marker of presence in many ways as well. And so, it takes on an important role. And it's interesting because you see this tension in one sense when we were talking about the Kaaba earlier. The Kaaba precedes Islam. It survives, traditions that came before the coming of Islam to the Arabian Peninsula, and yet the Kaaba is curtained with a new sense of meaning, a new sense of ritual and rite that comes with it, that is cloaked in Muslim theology, ways of being that resonate with the Muslim world. And so on some hand, we have this sense. And if we look at the earliest Muslim spaces, what's interesting is today we generally equate the mosque, the masjid, with Muslim practice. And I know from my research that, of course, there are many other spaces that we can look at that coexist alongside the masjid that are used by communities. But I think what's interesting is the earliest spaces that are created are actually not the masjid itself. The most sacred sites of Islam, the Kaaba, the Dome of the Rock, are sites that interestingly commune with nature. So the Kaaba, one of the reasons the Kaaba is seen to have a sacred character is because it has the black rock encased within it, which many people associate with a meteorite that may have come from space. The Dome of the Rock, again, the rock becomes an important element that centers itself around the space. And so we have these early spaces that exist, and eventually when empire becomes associated with Islam through the earliest, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, for example, the earliest Muslim empires, the creation of space also becomes not just a sacred act, it becomes a political act because it marks the presence of political power in these regions as well. And so, there are some very interesting things that come up. But again, coming back to this tension, God describes himself in the Quran using the metaphor of light. So, there's a verse of the Quran that says, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. And so, initially when I was thinking about a title for my book, one of the first titles I worked with was In Light-Filled Houses, because one of the ways in which God is seen as presenting him or herself is through this metaphor of light. And all of these sacred houses have this dimension of light, speaking, Jabala, to your sense of vibration and nature and some kind of connection to Great Spirit. In the same way, this mention of God as manifesting him or herself in this metaphor of light becomes really, really interesting. And yet at the same time, talking about the garden and separating ourselves from the garden, separation becomes a way in which we're always reminded that we're created by God and we need to return to him or her. And so I think, there is this sense that from God we come and to him or her we return. And we see this right throughout ritual and practice and space in the Muslim world, that the mosque in some ways, the Hanukkah or the Tekke of Sufis, the Jamavi of the Alavis, all of these spaces that the Imambar of the Shia that exist are ways in which at moments in time, space intersects to remind us of our relationship to our creator, and that return is something that we all long for. The famous Persian poet Rumi starts his epic poem, the Masnavi, by telling the story of the reed who is separated from the reed bed, and that lament, that sound that is made when one blows through that reed, the reed flute, is actually that longing tale of separation. And so, like all good stories and good epics, that sense of separation begins, that recognition that one is somehow devoid of, distant from where they came from, reminds us that we have a relationship to nature, to the creator, that we need to constantly remind ourselves of. And of course, Aslam, as you mentioned, space becomes, and sacred space becomes one way in which that sense of earthly time stops for a brief moment, and that sense of sacred time enters, and we are once again reminded that we also have another dimension to us, a dimension in which earthly time stops, a dimension in which we are reminded that beyond our physical being, there is another sense of who we are as individuals, and that that the time of the garden where we were once united with our Creator is no longer, and we are separated from the Creator once again. And if we are aware, or become aware of that longing, our prayer then becomes a way to remind ourselves of that time, and it becomes a working in some ways of how we can return to that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, when we think about a sacred space or a mosque, it brings up in my heart this feeling, because like you said, God is described as of the light. And as somebody who's seeking God, we're said in our tradition that we're seeking the light. And there's also, I don't know if it's a direct translation in English, but there's a way to say that our mosque or our temple is actually inside of us. And so when God says you're going to be born, but you will move away and you will have to continue to seek me and find me and work to come close and come back to me. In the same token, we're told that he's not far from us. Everywhere you look, there's God. And so when we think about this paradise that we once had and maybe are returning to, so some people call it heaven, some people call it Jannah. In our culture, we would say, you hear this often, the happy hunting grounds. And why are they called the happy hunting grounds? Because everything is promised. If we can get back to the connection with God, we will find our way back to the happy hunting grounds in this existence and ultimately in the hereafter. So in this existence, the tribal people are hunters gatherers. They hunt for deer or moose or elk, and they gather berries as a means of survival. And so this term happy hunting grounds, they say, came from a hunter who was passing on into the afterlife. And he said that he was going home back to the happy hunting grounds. And by that, he was saying that in this place, this paradise place, there's an abundance of food. There's an abundance of animals to hunt and berries to pick. And so our goal is always to work as hard as we can, but gently, of course, because it's this is easily accessed if we turn to it. God provides it. Great Spirit's there, willing and waiting to make this easy for us. But if we continue to seek that, we will find our way home, which is back with God. And it said that the light, if we can spark this light inside of us here on this earth, the light will recognize itself when we go into the afterlife. So if God is light and we've sparked the light inside us, they're going to come back together and they'll absorb each other and become one. So yeah, I love the idea of the inner temple, because we try to set up sacred spaces, and we see many demonstrations of that. Churches everywhere, mosques everywhere, Sikh temples, all kinds of things, right? But to think about the fact that we have a mosque right inside of us is almost heartwarming, because in the way I was raised as a tribal person, we're born with every single thing we need to survive, not just in our earthly experience, but to actually survive and gain this jhana, this paradise. So one of the first things we were given when we were a child was our breath, when we were first born. And so that's just one example of how we're born with all the tools that we need to get back to God. And yet we still somehow, through the lens and the community, society, political influence, we still tend to want to go and build these structures, these places to worship. One of the most beautiful things that I see with the indigenous ways is, and I know this echoes in Islam as well, is solitude, time away, stepping back from the world and actually having some solitude or some meditation space. And in the indigenous way, most definitely, we have something called the echka, which is in English would be like a vision quest, where we would go off into nature and fast and just pray and focus our full attention on God, and we would be said to be given information or have downloads or uploads, however you want to say it, of information that would help guide us further. We might have prophetic announcements come to us. We might have a light bulb moment of something that'll help us on our own personal journey. There's been all kinds of experiences in these vision quests, and I really do feel that the fasting aspect is another form of developing a sacred space without a structure around you. So we have nature as a way to, like, nature itself is a sacred space, but we also have fasting as a means to help hone ourselves back into reality and be able to see things through God's lens and remember the ultimate picture, the higher purpose. Yeah, those are really interesting points that you make, Rizwan, because I really do feel that you see this in tribal cultures as well, tribal diversity or sects or whatever you want to call us, because people don't always think this. I know there's lots of immigrants that come over and they just think, oh, a tribal person is a tribal person. But there's so many different tribes. There's so many different tribes, each having their own cultural influences, which has really structured the traditions and the beliefs, the rituals around how we approach God. But if you look at the tribes as a whole, there are some common threads that you can find among the collective of tribal understandings. And that's what I find most interesting. The key one, which I hope the Muslim viewers really listen, is that it was amazing to me when I met so many Muslims, and they thought, oh, we know who you are. Yes, we know the tribal people. You guys are the ones that worship creation. And this is of course haram to worship a bear or an eagle. This is a misunderstanding, I promise you, because the commonality that you'll find among most tribes, I would say, I speak from my own experience because I don't know all the tribes, is that there is one God. That's why we call him the Great Spirit. We have, in my language, we call it Tekelt Kukpi. Tekelt is like a covering that goes over and is above or the highest. Kukpi means chief or God. So when you talk about God, he's the ultimate, the highest. There's a supreme being that created all things. And we don't divide that or give worship to any other deities. But we do acknowledge creation as a means to access him. A friend of mine, a Muslim friend of mine, just reminded me, he said, you know, I hear this practice of the birds, the eagles in particular, that we should respect and honor the birds because they'll take your prayers up to the heavens for you and deliver the message to God. And so that made me really, really think about the importance of that. How yes, we have different lenses, different interpretations, different practices. Some might say this practice is wrong and that practice is right. But what I see myself as a theme among them all is that God has preserved the truth alive. It's been preserved. There's commonalities that remind us that there is one God, that we are all trying to go home, that we're all trying to attain this wonderful place called heaven. And there's always this need for us to go and find a way to worship. How can we worship better? So this is such a lovely topic for me because it gets me just all worked up. so many things we could talk about.
And there's, you know, I'm just hearing you, Jabala, thank you for that sort of beautiful description of Indigenous sort of understanding of the world and of the Great Spirit. I think that's really important for us. And again, a lot of the things you said resonate with many of the Muslim experiences that I was able to document as well. So this idea of solitude, of khalwa, becomes an important element, especially for Muslims of certain traditions and cultures, including mystical traditions, in which there is traditionally a retreat of about 40 days, in which people try and get in tune with themselves in hopes to better know their creator through prayer and breath. Again, is an important element, and mystical groups in particular have particular patterns of breathing, recitations of the names of God through that breathing over and over again, in hopes to invoke trance-like states or mystical states in which they too can find the creator here and now, not just in the world and time to come. And so this becomes an important element. And there are spaces then used to facilitate these practices, spaces of solitude, spaces of retreat that help to do so. And so I think that's important. And I think, talking about, again, the question I think you rightfully ask is, well, if these spaces are inside of us or can be inside of us, why do we need these mosques and temples and other spaces? And I think, we see this, one of the things that I think those things provide is a sense of community. And so, of course, we have the ability to pray with ourselves and seek ourselves, but we also can't deny that we live congregationally, that we live in community. And so there are opportunities for communities to come together in many of these spaces, to pray together, to speak with each other, to learn from each other. And so I think community, of course, becomes a really interesting element in these regards too. And here on the screen, you can see here is one of the most beautiful rituals that we see amongst Muslim communities. Any of you who watch BBC or CNN International News, you'll notice whenever there's an ad for Turkey, you can't miss the spiritual capital of the whirling dervishes, who provide that beautiful sense of connecting the divine to the world through sacred dance and prayer. And the idea of whirling itself, for those of you who haven't seen it, in the notion of the whirling dervishes, is this idea of taking the grace and barakah from the heavens and channeling it down to earth through ritual and prayer. The right hand traditionally faces upwards to the heavens, and the left hand faces downwards to the ground. And in this sort of beautiful and majestic act to watch, it's quite amazing. And yet, ironically, even though it's a strong part of the spiritual capital of Turkey and the former Ottoman empires, in 1924, with the founding of the modern Turkish state and Kemal Ataturk, you have public display of religion, and Sufism in particular, banned. And so the whirling dervishes, the Mevlevis, were forced to go underground, and yet it still survives in interesting ways. And so congregation becomes important to do so. And I think the other thing that I think community spaces bring together is this important act of serving others. So we've talked about the notion of knowing God, but I think one of the ways in which we can serve God is also by helping our fellow humanity. And this becomes an important element too. And in certain cultural traditions, especially we're talking about Turkey itself, there is the tradition of the imaret and the kuliye, this idea of the soup kitchen, the complex, which include the school, a madrasa, a place to serve those who are less fortunate than ourselves. And so these become important elements of the mosque complex themselves. And so while prayer is one way in which we can interact with the divine, there are other ways as well that we can interact with others. So this is Yeni Jami in Istanbul as well. And here you can see obviously the cascading domes and minarets of this particular mosque, but you'll see that the walls surrounding it are much larger because they encapsulate so many other buildings in serving the rest of fellow humanity and creation. So there is an imperative to serve others as well. And so this becomes an important element too, as does nature. And we see nature incorporated within the mosque and within other spaces of Muslim worship as well. And so, one of the things that I can think of is in the Chinese example of mosques. We think of mosques as being single edifices, but what's really interesting in the Chinese example, especially amongst the Hui Muslims, the largest ethnic group of Muslims in China, is that there is a garden and the mosque is actually placed within the garden. And so there are gates and cascading buildings that emerge within these spaces as well. And so the garden becomes a setting in which the mosque is set. And so nature becomes the landscape in which then contemplation can happen. The garden in some ways precedes the mosque in the same way that the garden precedes our sense of our interaction with the sacred. And so it becomes a site of contemplation. And it reminds us that the mosque, of course, is a simple reminder, but it's in nature itself that we begin to sort of see the ability to interact with the divine. And so there's, I think, some some really interesting consonances and echoes between the way Indigenous communities and traditions think about the sacred and the way Muslim communities and traditions also interact with and think about and contemplate the sacred as well.
Yeah,
thank
I
you
was
for
gonna.
that.
Sorry, Asla.
I was going to say, like, just it shows that continuum, right? The way that we see the sacred within ourselves, within community, within nature, within something broader within the mosque as well. But also there are these in-between spaces. There was a question from Mesa Huck over here about the thoughts on like extravagant, beautiful, lavish, sacred spaces, and how those are sometimes separate or removed from nature. But these examples of mosques in China, for example, where the mosque is situated within the garden rather than being separate from. So as much as we sometimes have these like clear delineations, we also have a lot of like continuity between space, between self, community, the divine. And I think sometimes when I think about like the Tawheed, it's like it's all of it. It's in everything. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say with the sense of community, how in your book, first of all, I was reading that it's, and I've seen this actually because the mosque in Port Coquitlam was the first mosque I ever entered. And as I entered there, I was like, what, why is there a basketball hoop? There's a gymnasium in here. There's a full kitchen. And I was, wait, is this a church? I was like, what is this place? And it's interesting because you're right, like religion and the sacred space does seem to pull in the sense of community because it does serve multi-purposes. Like we see these things, and that's a way of bringing the collective together. With the Indigenous culture, we see the same thing. We come together, we might set up a temporary ceremonial site, whatever the ceremony might be, but always there's going to be eating after. And when we talk about bringing people together and the religion or the sacred space bringing people together, we see this in our practice, especially when we go back to like the old times, the past. We look at how First Nations, when we sit in, I'm using these terms interchangeably, Indigenous, First Nations, but we see this happen when the old way was to sit shoulder to shoulder. So when I first entered a mosque and I saw the sisters, come closer to me, and I'm like, why are they touching my shoulder? Why are we bunched together like this? But I started thinking, wait a second, this is very familiar to me, because when we sit in ceremony, it does not matter if you're in a little tiny sweat lodge and it's just so hot in there, you're going to be nice and tight to your neighbor, and you're going to be in the collective. And as you start going through these, like we see with the whirling dervishes, the same thing happens in our ceremonies, where as you start entering the light and coming close to the light and activating that higher self in you that connects to God, the God within, you start having a collective experience. And I see this, I've seen this, I don't know if many of the viewers have experienced this, but it's true. You end up in this collective space where suddenly you're not you're this soul, and you're seeing souls, like you were saying earlier, Rizwan, God sees souls, not necessarily gender. And that's where, when you get into that space, you start seeing the person across from you in the beauty in the creation that they were designed under, and you connect. And so what I find is these spaces that we enter, I've witnessed it myself. People come to, maybe there's conflict in a community, maybe there's so-and-so isn't fond of so-and-so, and there's these rocky waters, right? But then they come into a sacred space, and maybe there's a little bit of agitation at first, but as you start to activate and become absorbed into the energy of God, all those conflicts or those struggles that you're having with your neighbor, they wash away. And I find it interesting how, as those things wash away, there's a very beautiful collective idea of what a sacred space is. And that's where we get away from, yes, exactly, this beautiful picture here. Exactly, we get away from thinking that we're in a structure and I'm there by myself, and we start realizing I'm sitting with my brothers and sisters. We all have the same intention. And when I talk about intention, it's really interesting because I want to go cycle back to the breath experience. So when we're in our mother's womb, we're in there and we don't breathe through our lungs. We get our oxygen from the umbilical cord. And so when we come out of this soul space into our mother's womb and we're about to step into this really physical human experience, we're birthed and we're sitting there going, okay, I just came out of my mother's womb and I'm panicking because I don't have light. I'm at risk of losing this life. And you get, you're in there and you're like, oh my God, I can't breathe. And then all of a sudden you have the intention, I gotta survive. I have to survive. How do I survive? And all of a sudden, doctor spanks the baby or however it happens, and the baby takes a big breath. And in that first breath, in comes the intention to live. That life energy from Great Spirit comes in and sparks you to life. And so I love the idea of the whirling dervishes, because I did have a beautiful experience with the whirling dervishes. I was at a breath ceremony, and I want to send kudos out to my mentor, Robin Clements. He's my teacher in the breath. And it's interesting because when we look at different modalities of healing and reconnecting to God within, or God of the universe, however you want to define it, we got to always think about the intention. We got to think about the breathing, and in a particular modality that I studied, there's a left and a right to the person. So your left side is considered your receiving side, and your right side as your giving side. And through this, we start to see how we can take in life energy and how we can give or send life energy, or if you want to compare it more closely to spiritual practice, or like you say, we encourage each other through our religious, our rituals and stuff. We might influence our neighbor. Well, we can do those things as well when we set intentions. And I find it interesting that the whirling dervishes, like you said, one hand is down while the other hand is up. And the left hand, as you were saying, is pointed down to Mother Earth. And when I think of the teachings I was raised with, we came to this earth, and the earth, Mother Earth, is to give us everything we need for life. Everything that we need for life is here on the earth. And so it just makes sense to me in that the left side is receiving the energy of Mother Earth. And here we're able to send that same message back out, maybe through our right side, if you follow that modality. But it's not so much about sticking within the constraints of that philosophy. It's more about realizing that as we're taking in, we're also cycling it back out and sending something good out, and maybe bringing somebody else into the beautiful light. I wanted to go back to like when we say we were here from time immemorial, when the earth was first created, or however you view the beginning, from an indigenous perspective, everything started following a circular pattern, and my daughter calls it the great circle of life. I think she got it off of the Lion King or wherever, but it's true. When we came into this, everything runs circular, and as somebody's being born, somebody's dying. As we take something from the earth, we also give back. As we receive spiritual support or guidance, somebody next to us will also receive spiritual support and guidance. So it just keeps going around and around, and there's really no end to it. We just need to know how to step into that and be willing to be part of the circle, and not separate ourselves from the things around us. Be connected to the universe, be connected to our brothers and sisters, and bring us back to that sense of community, because we were not put on this planet as an individual. We do have our individual elements, but really there's an ummah for a reason. There's purpose between being here with each other. And ultimately it'll bring us back to our ultimate destiny and bring us into jhana. And maybe by the time we get there, we'll have learned a few things, right?
I think that sense of reciprocity and balance is really, really important. We live in a world now where that sense of individualism, the individualness, selfishness that many of us, it's a force that becomes very strong, and it oftentimes erodes the sense of community. And we see, I see this right across the Muslim world, that it's not the individual that's the base unit of society, it's the family, it's the community. And it's that family around which values are formed, around decisions are made. It's not the individual. And today, of course, we see these very strong forces of materialism, of individuality, trying to break down those traditional notions of family, of community, which at one point were arguably relatively indivisible. They were able to govern, make. But today, we see very different forces sort of trying to pry us open and trying to sort of divide those strong senses of community, of family that once governed the choices we made, the decisions we made, the morals we had. And, in traditional societies, whether they be indigenous societies, whether they be Muslim societies, speak and are organized around those very principles, whether it's congregation, whether it's coming together, whether it's our funerals and our weddings. All of those things are really sort of brought together in the context of that sense of family, of community. And it's, I think many of the sacred spaces we have honor those strong senses of coming together and being together.
Yeah, and I think I've got two questions. So the one is around that photo that I shared, because the first time that I heard about the Al-Vali society that you shared with us. So do you want to just say a little bit more about this picture and how it relates to what Jabala was saying?
Yeah, so the Alevis are a Muslim, they're the second largest Muslim community in Turkey. Estimates are hard to come by, but estimates are about 25 million within Turkey and about 5 million within with the largest communities in France and Europe, France and Germany and Europe. And the Alevis are interesting. They're ethnically traditional. They're a Kurdish community. They're rural historically, but of course, over the last century, they've moved to the cities of Turkey and of Europe as well. And the Alevis are, I have to say, a unique community in the sense that I've worked with, in that men and women pray together in the same space. They're not divided. And in Alevi belief, it's understood that God doesn't see the body. He doesn't see gender. He only sees the soul. And so men and women sit side by side traditionally, although unfortunately things are changing in Alevi society because of pressures from Sunni communities and others, where you're seeing more separation between the sexes in certain Genovese. But there are sacred dances that take place, and so you can see men and women even holding hands, men and women sitting next to each other. And just as we see with the pilgrimage at the Kaaba, the most heightened of rituals, we see this notion of gender dissolve in many cases. But here, men and women come together in unison. They pray together. They offer the gratitude together. They recount their history together. And again, you'll see on the wall there are images. The Alevis, although they don't articulate their identity as being Shia or Sunni, there are influences from both communities, including mystical communities, as part of their religious practices. So the images you see around the top of the picture that you see are of the 12 Shia imams, because they honor and recognize the imams not as imams in the Shia tradition, but as important givers to community theology. And also just below that, you have a picture of Haji Bektash Ali, who is believed to be the founder, who brought Islam to the Alevi community. And talking about nature again, he is believed to have brought Islam in the form of a dove. And so you see these doves cascading from his physical image there, which talking about the mythic again as well, about how Islam is brought to them as a religion of peace, not by the sword or not by force. But it's a very interesting, because it challenges the sense that Islam, number one, happens in the mosque. It happens with gender segregated, and so the Alevis are a case in point of what diversity looks like on the ground. And of course, as you can imagine, they're embattled. They have challenges in terms of practicing their faith. in teaching their religion to their children in the Turkish Republic, because Turkey defines Islam in very particular ways, of the Islam of the mosque, the Sunni Islam. But yet you see this kind of beauty emerge that transcends some of the customs and regulations that we see amongst the ways in which Muslims of other communities pray as well. But the sacred, when you come into communion with the sacred, each of the Muslim communities that I've looked at, including the Alavis, are really trying to formulate and find a way to engage with the divine. And this is the ways in which the Alavis, through their tradition and history, continue to do so to this day.
Yeah. And I think, Jabala, you were saying like 7 generations ago, like what did sacred space look like?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to our theme a little bit, because I love that you bring up the Alavis, because when we look back at the indigenous ways of old times, it was quite the opposite, at least in my tribe. And I think for most tribes, we did have a segregation. The men and women were separate, maybe for different reasons than Islam would do such, but it's said that men have their own dynamic energy, their own powers or superpowers, however you refer them, and women are very powerful in their feminine energy. And so it's really important that we in the old ways, we keep separate and in order to stay focused and in our prayers, and so we saw this division in the old times. But as colonialism came, genocidal acts were performed on the tribal people as a means to wipe us out and to stop us from practicing our faith. We did lose a lot of our traditions and rituals, and so as a means to reclaim that, in current present day, we see things that were expected of the past, for example, gender separation, becoming something that fades away now, because now we see male and female mixing together in ceremony. And also we see the changes of, now we're post, I don't want to say post genocide because I have my own opinion about this, but I will say that now we've come through to where more and more people are waking up or becoming enlightened about the true history of Canada. And we see now that many other races adore us. They admire us for our faith. We've managed to, as a tribal people, retain the understanding. Somehow they stripped everything away from us, the colonialists. They banned our ceremonies, which was our prayer spaces. They denied us access to like our sweat lodge, for example. They denied us from speaking our language. They did everything to wipe away and remove anything that was spiritual or religious about us, and tried to mainstream us into a colonial way of thinking. But in this present day, as we're reclaiming this, and we're finding more and more people are recognizing and acknowledging the goodness of the way we lived in the past, and they see the goodness of our hearts still. There's more people, and I see Muslims as well, more people wanting to come and learn about the indigenous ways. This is another difference from the past times. Now, sure, before anybody came here and we were the first original peoples, of course, there was nobody ever stopped at the door from coming to our ceremonies because you were tribal. But as settlers started coming in, and there were these outsiders, if you want to call them that, we were very guarded after attacks on our faith and restrictions put upon us. I would say it was fair that we were very guarded on continuing to share our knowledge or continuing to share our ceremonies. And so I know that my elders have told me that there was a time when there was no outsiders allowed at our ceremonies. But I just came from a ceremony on Mission Flats the other day in an expression against TMX, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And at that ceremony, I can tell you, the high percentage of people that were there were non-natives. They were not indigenous. They were actually, we had 3 or 4 Muslims. We had all kinds of races, Indian, Japanese, all kinds of different races. And you see them coming together and sitting with us now. And this I see as a powerful way to reconnect and reclaim who we were. Because some people, like my elders told me, And I learned this also through my mentor, Robin Clements, too. I've witnessed this in ceremony, that there's a genetic coding that was given to us. Each tribe, each creation had a certain vibration energy, had a certain mapping in the design, a beautiful design. And with the tribal people, we believe that this exists in us. You can take everything away from us. And it brings me back to what I said. We're born with everything we need to worship better. We were born with all the tools right here without these buildings or these structures or these ceremonies or whatever you call them. We're born with it. And so what we're seeing now is like almost like a regressive memory that's in our DNA that is coming out in the newer generations. So this happened for me, sitting in ceremonies and reconnecting to my tribal roots. I was in there and I was astounded when suddenly I'm praying intensely and I'm starting to feel like I'm fully activated with God, and I'm understanding, I'm getting information and understanding coming in, and I'm going, wow, I'm starting to remember my language. I'm starting to remember some of the things that were ritualistic of the past. Somehow I know how to handle a sacred item. For example, I shouldn't take the Quran and put it on the floor, or I shouldn't take an eagle feather, which might have been annotated as sacred. I wouldn't take that and leave it in a dirty place, for example. It's almost like a common sense thing comes through, and then I'm starting to reconnect. And what I find beautiful in the way that faith or religion, if you want to call it, has morphed within the tribal people, it is morphing into this beautiful thing where there's the lines or the barriers that kept us apart from the white people or the colonialists, the settlers, whatever you want to say. Those barriers are coming down, and people are starting to go, okay, it doesn't matter if you're Catholic, it doesn't matter if you're Christian, if you're Muslim, if you're whatever you identify yourself with. When you come into a tribal space, there's a very beautiful way that we hold ourselves and we hold the people around us, that we all have that common interest, again, to seek God.
Yeah, I think there's maybe some final thoughts as the time is slowly coming to an end. You know, Islam, no matter where we go in the world, we see this infusion of like the local culture, the local customs, the local tradition with this like, Islamic lens that is brought into it. And what Jabala, what you're describing now reminds me so much of like conversations I'm having with young Muslim people who are reconnecting with ideas of Khalifa Walad, right? To be stewards of the land. And when we say that, we're just like, oh, that's exactly the same terms that are being used by indigenous people on this land to steward the earth. So do we see this kind of like confluence of like indigenous spirituality, customs, traditions, the valuing of land, water, earth, being infused, or like Islam coming together with that as a way of like cultural infusion and coming together? Or is that also just like kind of like a hopeful, simplistic reading of what might be happening given all of the uncertainties in the world and how spaces and spirituality are being wrestled with?
I honestly, I feel personally, most definitely, this is what I feel, is that God has, he's found a way, obviously, to unite us and remind us of our duty to steward the earth. This was one of the most beautiful things I found when I found Islam, is that, wow, this is a religion who cares about the earth. They take a big responsibility of the space around them. They don't pollute. They you know, it's like these people. We see so many other religions that have come in, and not just religions, but corporations or even government, I would dare say, comes in and they impose these things that are not at all caretaking the earth. And going back to the 7 generations, which you mentioned, it's been in tribal teachings for eons that you look at the past 7 generations and you learn from that, how were we living? How did we do? And you start meditating upon that, and you spend the time to really, really think, what did the ancestors do before us? What did they do wrong? And then you look at the future generations, the 7 generations that are coming, and you go, okay, the 7 generations that are coming, those are my children and my grandchildren. How do I want them to live? And I think about, okay, the way I'm living now, how is that going to affect them? What do I want for them? And you meditate upon that. And that's where I love this timeline, because you look at the past 7, you look at the future 7, aha, I know how to live my life today. That's the biggest cues to help guide us how to live. What kind of space, not just sacred space, but isn't everything sacred? We're here on this beautiful earth. We were told to travel about on it, not have any barriers, nothing stopping us, to go around and spread this love and joy and reconnect. And that's what guides us on how to act today. And we see, I would say globally, what's happening is the work that the Indigenous people have started. We really opened up a path. I would say, I feel that we've led the way as far as grassroots movements, stewarding the earth, protecting the land and water. We've always said this. And for a long time, this fell on deaf ears. It felt like no one was listening, but we trusted God was listening. God was going to open a way. And that's where I feel now God has come in, and he's bringing these little pieces, and he's uniting us. And it's not just the natives. It's not just us that are saying this now. And I see Muslims down at the TMX site, the Mission Flats, where we were expressing against the Trans Mountain Pipeline. They're wanting to build this pipeline under the river, and this is carrying much higher more damaging toxic waste than it was ever run through pipes before, and they want to put it under our waterways. Well, I'm down there and I'm seeing Muslims come around. I'm seeing Catholics come. I'm seeing like all these different religious denominations, but also I'm seeing there's people who used to support corporate bodies that were all for the governments who voted them in to make this pipeline happen. And something happened. God is bringing the light. God is waking people up, and we're all starting to remember that we were put here for a purpose. First of all, we should be connecting and learning what our destiny is, how we can be in our highest self, and live not in friction with the way we were designed to live our life, but actually work with it. And that's where life becomes easier. We see everybody's coming together. Globally, I'm starting to see more and more people, not just Indigenous, standing up for the earth. And in that work is the beauty that God comes back into it. Even somebody who's an atheist and is out there protecting the earth, eventually, I've seen it myself, one by one, those people are no longer atheists, because they are connecting to the earth. And when you connect to the things, the created things, the earth, the plants, the sea creatures, insects, you begin to remember God. You can't not. God's in everything.
Yeah, it's this 14 sort of generation long view, the past and the present, Jabala, I think it's a great meditative tool and an antidote to presentism we see amongst many people today, of just thinking about ourselves in this generation. It's something that's very, very hard to do. I think it comes much more naturally to Indigenous traditions and cultures, because you have this very long-term view of the world. But I think for myself, it's a great way to help us think about what we've inherited, what our ancestors have done for us, and what our role and responsibility is to those that will come after us. And it reminds me, talking about stewardship, one of the first things that Adam is entrusted with when he comes to the earth, he's entrusted with this responsibility of stewardship. The story in the Quran talks about God asking all of nature, including the mountains, but even the mountains reply that, looking after the rest of creation is too much of a responsibility that will crumble. And yet, man takes on this responsibility. And unfortunately, it's a responsibility that many of us have forgotten, have neglected. And yet, through the work that you're doing, that many Indigenous communities and traditions naturally do, it's a reminder that our responsibility is to not just ourselves, but to the earth, to future generations, to our collective humanity, because ultimately it's Mother Earth that does sustain us, that keeps us going. And Earth has an amazing way of repairing itself when things go awry, when things don't sort of go as expected. We see the Earth find ways to heal in interesting ways, but unfortunately, man keeps interrupting that healing process again and again. And the challenge, of course, is then how do we, what can the Earth take, and how much can it take it? And at what stage does it then rebel, and at what stage is that repairing so difficult to do that then we ourselves are obviously disrupted and interrupted in the lives that we have as well. And so I think there is a strong tradition in the Muslim world that we coexist and cohabit the earth. We're not we have this role that we play, but that with that role comes a responsibility. And so it's balance. And I think Indigenous cultures and traditions tell it beautifully when they speak about the spirits that exist in all of nature and all of creation, because they really enchant creation with that sense of beauty, of role, of nature, of the balance that should exist in the world. And we know all too well that humanity is great at disrupting that constant balance, and nature is always trying to rectify that balance. And so it's that tussle back and forth between trying to find where the world should be, should return to the world as it's meant to be. And so, yeah, I think it's a wonderful way to think about the world.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the healing, like you said, Mother Earth seems to find a way to heal it herself. I've been hearing a lot of talk from my brothers and sisters in the tribal community that we see a lot of the sisters and the mothers, the matrilineal side of things going through some suffering right now. And it's being equated directly to the suffering of Mother Earth, because when we talk about our connection to our surroundings, everything has a connection. The women believe, I hear this over and over, the women believe that we're hurting and we're suffering because we're the nurturers, we're the life givers. We can carry children, babies, we can birth babies and create this beautiful life. And when we see the earth being destroyed and basically raped of its resources, they say that we'll heal when we heal the earth. When Mother Earth heals, we'll also heal as a people. So that's one thing I wanted to touch on, but I also wanted to say how I think it was in a conversation with you, Aslam, you reminded me of the story about King Solomon, how he talked to the ant, or he heard the ants talking to him. He had to stop all his horsemen behind him. Wait, the ant they're trying to cross here, because the ant is telling them we need to cross. Well, as we connect to God, I should say, the tribal people have done this for a long time. In my lineage, we have still, my daughter is one of them that is a communicator with the animals. She can hear them as if they're speaking in her tongue. And I have a little bit of that myself. It happens. And that's where I look around and I start getting off the reservation. I look around like, these people are so disconnected. They're not even listening to what the bird's telling them over there, or the deer is crying out and they didn't hear its message. I see this and I think, oh my goodness, how disconnected we've come, that we've forgotten that we have these innate powers. I refer to them as powers, but they're just natural gifts. I mean, it happened to the people who walked before us. And if we connect to God, it can happen for us too, that suddenly we're connected to everything living. We coexist, like Rizwan said. And I think there's a beauty in that we need to, now we need to embellish it, because when the settlers first came, and I will mention the churches, nothing against anyone who's a churchgoer, but I will say that when they first came and they saw, here's these people that dance around a fire with feathers in their hair, and we were accused of being like possessed, or that we were the savages that were maybe working with the demons, or all kinds of things were accused against us. And so now, as we're reclaiming our heritage, our culture, and our faith, we're now able to stand up boldly and say, we have some things that we can teach you. We might not have a structured religion in the common sense, but we've always had this faith, and we have a way to share these teachings with you. And that's why I love Islam, is that I haven't found anything yet that conflicts. I'm still searching. I'm new. I'm a new revert, but I tell you, I'm finding so many commonalities that I really want to see the Indigenous and the Muslims come together. And please, if you think that, I'll give you an example. I had a Muslim sister. She came to a ceremony and she ran out. She was practically in tears when she left, because when they started drumming, she was so scared that we were calling demons in, and she got very frightened. But when we started talking afterwards and got to the root meaning of what we were there to do and the purpose of it, we found so many commonalities. And again, that's coming back to the collective. We just need to have an open mind and have patience, because we don't always understand something that's on the surface, right?
Yeah, I think maybe Rizwan is a question over here. How do you think colonialism has influenced Muslim conceptions of sacred spaces? So you've traveled around the world and you've seen some of these, but particularly in Canada, how has that been impacted? And not at all controversial term, how can Muslims decolonize by learning from Indigenous concepts of sacred space?
Wow, I think it's an amazing question, and one that would take more than a few minutes to unpack. But I think it's I think you're thinking in very interesting ways about space, and I think there's two ways to think about it. So oftentimes, as Muslim communities migrate from their home environments to Canada, they oftentimes bring those conceptions of sacred space with them. So what the mosque looks like in a Pakistan or a Tajikistan or a Syria, for example, is brought into the home environment. And when you come into a country like Canada, which where we don't have a single ethnicity, aren't dominated by one group over another. There are differences in terms of the way spaces are conceived. But oftentimes, if there is a group who finances a space, funds a space, creates it, forms a committee to build a space, those conceptions oftentimes feed into what space should be, can be, from how it's governed, to who can use it. When I think of a non-Canadian example, but I think one that brings the question home, and then I'll talk about how, as Canadian Muslims, we may be able to respond or reconceptualize space. When I visited Indonesia and the island of Java in particular, Indonesia has the largest number of Muslims in the world, more than the entire Middle East. And the island of Java in particular is predominantly Muslim. And when I traveled there, there was a couple of things that I realized. I first realized that, except from the earliest mosques that were built in Java, Javanese mosques historically didn't face the Qibla, didn't face the Kaaba at Mecca. They actually oriented themselves on a west to east axis. And then around 1970, when there was more Saudi funding available to build mosques, one of the things that began to happen is that there was this tussle between local Indonesian and Japanese architects and mosque builders and Saudi funding. And so Saudis, as a prerequisite, required obviously mosques to face Mecca, to face the Kaaba, while many Indonesians pushed against it because in their traditional understandings of orientation and power, energy flowed from west to east, not from the Kaaba at Mecca. And what was interesting is that the word Qibla in Javanese Islam doesn't just mean to face Mecca; it also means to obey. And so when a mosque wasn't Qibla-ing, it wasn't actually obeying the kind of power structure. And so in this way, you have the idea, of course, the Kaaba as having a sacred role in Islam, but according to the Javanese conception, it also had a political role, because Mecca then became the political center of the Muslim world, not just the spiritual center of the Muslim world. And so from that period, from about the 15th century right about to 1970, traditional Javanese mosques didn't face the Kaaba. Post 1970, the majority of mosques do. And so you see very strongly a colonial kind of mentality that exists in even how mosques should orient themselves and who should govern them. In the Canadian context, we were talking about gender, we were talking about this idea of how people can reclaim or decolonize these spaces. And I think, in Canada, we have generally a very strong democratic culture. in which we have people coming together and debating and conversing around these issues. And I think, again, when we talk about decolonizing space, it's recognizing these power relationships that exist, these inheritances that we have. And so coming together to contribute to not just you may inherit a mosque, you may not be participating in building it, but I realized very early in my research that each community effectively creates its own mosque, in the sense of that the culture that exists within each mosque is very different from community to community, from place to place, from city to city, because it's the people that really create the culture that governs that mosque. And so I think coming together in an environment of partnership, of talking about what the sacred can look like, what our relationship to the sacred can look like when it comes to our prayer, really can make a difference. But of course, you need to have receptive structures that allow you to do that and facilitate that purpose. And so when it comes to decolonizing the mosque, I think when we talk about Muslims, Canadian Muslims, and I mean that broadly in the sense of Muslims born in Canada, converts, people who think about themselves in Canadian Muslim terms rather than those of their parents or grandparents who may have migrated here from other countries and cultures. It's important to realize that there is this democratic tradition in Islam of thinking about space and sacred space in ways that, of course, recognize the power structures that exist, and in many cases, deferring to them where necessary, but also recognizing that we have a voice. And I realized in my book very early on that one of the biggest responsibilities I had was giving voice to those who traditionally didn't have voice in the Muslim world, listening to the ways in which they thought and understood Islam that may not have been captured in traditional ways of narrating Islam to others. And so I think as we think about our own experiences of what it means to be Muslim and what Islam is, when we talk about decolonizing these spaces, it's important that we also have an important voice in that process too, and find ways to do so if we can.
Thank you so much. It just so happens that Jabala, she warned us that her internet might cut out somewhere between 9:15 and 9:30, and hopefully she'll be able to log back on, but I'm not sure she will be able to before we wrap up. Oh, here we go. That's great.
There we are.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect kind of closing remarks. I think that this conversation about decolonizing is very aligned with what we're trying to do through these conversations. And even when I initially started thinking about this conversation about sacred spaces, I was like, great, we'll talk about mosques, we'll talk about Jamaat Khanas, we'll talk about Fankas maybe, and then we'll talk about sweat lodges, and we'll talk about this. But as we've shown in this conversation, like those boundaries are in many ways like part of our old ways of thinking about sacred space. And this conversation has allowed us to weave right through into ourselves and in community and family spaces in nature, as well as spaces that are designed specifically for ritual practice. So I think this is part of that process of like questioning and trying to re-understand from the ground up what our understandings of sacredness and sacred space are as well. I want to thank both of you so much for guiding us through this conversation and sharing so generously all the wisdom that you carry with you and the stories that you hold as well. Lots of thanks coming through in the chat box as well, and I'm sure lots of people will be benefiting from this in recordings as well. So thank you again, Jabala. Thank you, Rizwan. Thank you to all the attendees and those who supported and looked after children so that you could be here and enjoy this event, and all the other support that we have around us and the care provided to us. And yeah, we hope to see you at some future events. If you want to have a look at what other Islamic History Month events are happening, please check out IslamicHistoryMonth.ca. We've got a national panel of Black Muslim women talking about their experiences in Canada coming up next Saturday, I believe, on the 31st. And all the details will be posted to the CCMS Facebook page as well. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Thank both of you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.